Have you ever been so certain about something, about your worth, your rights, and your place in the world, only to have someone make you question everything in a single, unexpected moment? What happens when you are stripped of that certainty by a person you least expect it from? Someone who's supposed to show you respect. You'd be shocked, wouldn't you? But what if those three words were the very thing that would turn your life upside down? This is the story of Captain Richard Owens, a man who has spent his life reaching for the skies, breaking barriers, and defying expectations. But on one fateful flight, he learned that no matter how high you soar, some people still refuse to see you for who you truly are. It was supposed to be a regular flight, just another day at work. Richard had been flying for over a decade, always professional, always reliable. He'd worked his way up the ranks in a field where minorities were often underrepresented, earning respect not just from his colleagues but from his passengers too. As a black man in a world where doors didn't open easily for people like him, Richard had learned to rise above it all. But that morning, that fateful morning, everything was about to change. He'd boarded the plane early, just like any other pilot would, heading to his assigned seat in the first-class section. But this time was different. The stewardess, a woman in her late 20s named Emily, looked at Richard, her gaze flicking between his uniform and his face, before speaking with a tone that made him pause. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "This seat is for first-class passengers only." Richard was taken aback. He was, after all, the captain of the plane. He had every right to be there. He was used to a certain level of respect, but the way she spoke to him, it felt different. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment too long. There was something in the air, something unspoken. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Richard replied, trying to maintain his calm. "I am the pilot. This is my seat." But instead of apologizing or quickly understanding the mistake, Emily's expression hardened. She gave him an icy stare and then uttered three words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You don't belong here." The words felt like a slap to the face, cutting deeper than anything physical ever could. Richard froze, his pulse quickening. It was as if time had stopped. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Was this really happening? The words echoed in his mind. "You don't belong here." In that instant, Richard saw it all. The years of hard work, the sacrifices, the struggles, and all the barriers he had broken down. None of it mattered. To Emily, he was still just another black man trying to take something that didn't belong to him. The people around them started to notice. Some glanced over nervously. Others avoided eye contact, pretending like nothing was happening. But Richard could feel it. He could feel their judgment, their discomfort, their unwillingness to stand up and speak out. He was on his own in that moment, isolated in a sea of indifference. But then something unexpected happened. Richard took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure to just walk away, to not make a scene. But this wasn't just about him. This was bigger than a seat on a plane. This was about everything he had ever stood for. The fight against racism, the fight for equality. He wasn't going to let this slide. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady now, carrying a strength he didn't even know he had. "I think you should check your facts. I'm Captain Richard Owens. I'm the one flying this plane today." The stewardess looked him up and down, her gaze sharp and unyielding. For a moment, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. She opened her mouth, but before she could respond, something incredible happened. From the back of the plane, a familiar voice rang out. "Is there a problem here?" It was Captain Sarah Jennings, the lead flight attendant for this flight. Sarah had been a mentor to Richard. She had seen him rise from the beginning and knew the kind of person he was: strong, determined, and deserving of every ounce of respect. Richard turned to face Sarah, his eyes meeting hers. But instead of offering the support he'd hoped for, Sarah's expression was unreadable. She stood there, silent, as the tension between Richard and Emily grew. "Yes, Captain Owens," Sarah finally said, her tone now cold and distant. "There is a problem." And with those words, the ground beneath Richard's feet seemed to crumble away. What was going on here? Was Sarah turning on him too? The last thing Richard saw before the world spun into chaos was Sarah's eyes. Eyes that had once filled him with hope. Now they were filled with something else. Something he couldn't quite understand. It was the beginning of something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. And as the confrontation intensified, the crowd grew more silent. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just a simple mistake. Something bigger was at play. As Richard stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, he realized one chilling truth. He was about to have his entire world turned upside down. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Richard stood there, his heart racing, trying to understand what was happening. Sarah, the woman he'd looked up to, the one who had always shown him kindness and respect, was now treating him like an intruder on his own plane. The words, "There is a problem," still hung in the air, thick with a sense of betrayal that gnawed at his insides. Emily, the stewardess who had denied him his seat, stood by silently now, a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. She wasn't going to back down. And Sarah's eyes were cold, her stance stiff, as though she was waiting for something. "What do you mean, there's a problem?" Richard finally asked, his voice strained but strong. He was trying to keep it together, but the confusion and anger were bubbling to the surface. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at Emily, then back at Richard. The tension in the cabin was almost unbearable. The passengers, who had once been oblivious to the conversation, were now all watching, their eyes darting from one person to the next. It was clear they knew something was wrong. "Captain Owens," Sarah said slowly, her tone deliberate, "I'm afraid we have to follow the rules. You don't have a first-class ticket." Richard blinked. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "I'm the pilot. My seat is in first class. I've always been seated there." "I'm sorry, sir," Sarah replied, her voice devoid of warmth. "But without the proper ticket, you're not entitled to that seat." Richard shook his head, trying to process what was happening. He looked around at the other flight attendants, at the passengers, all of them watching. None of them said anything. It was as though they were all complicit in this silent, suffocating moment. And then, to make matters worse, Emily added, "We can find another seat for you, if you'd like. Maybe somewhere in coach." The suggestion of sitting in coach, after all these years of working hard to be where he was, hit Richard like a ton of bricks. It wasn't about the seat itself. It was about what this moment represented. It was about being told, in no uncertain terms, that despite everything he had worked for, despite the years of dedication, he wasn't good enough to sit with the rest of the first-class passengers. He wasn't good enough to be treated with the respect he deserved. "Is this really happening?" Richard whispered to himself. "Am I really being told to sit in coach?" Sarah's eyes flickered briefly, but she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "I'm just following protocol," she said, as if that was supposed to make everything okay. "I don't think you understand," Richard said, his voice rising. "I'm the captain of this flight. I'm the one in charge here." Sarah stepped back slightly, as if the intensity of his words had startled her. "I understand, Captain, but the rules are the rules." Richard's mind was racing. He could feel the eyes of every passenger burning into him. Some were uncomfortable. Others were outright staring, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before them. There was a moment of pure disbelief, as though no one in the cabin could fathom that something like this was happening. But Richard wasn't backing down. Not this time. "Sarah," he said, his tone shifting to one of authority, "I'm not leaving. I'm not going anywhere. You can try to push me, but this is my seat. And if you think I'm going to let you disrespect me like this, you're mistaken." For the first time, there was a flicker of hesitation in Sarah's eyes. Was it guilt? Was it uncertainty? Richard couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. He knew that this moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the people who had been forced to endure this kind of treatment in silence. And then, the unexpected happened. A voice came from the back of the plane, booming with authority. "What is going on here? I need to know right now." It was Captain Ronald Hayes, the senior pilot for the airline, and a longtime colleague of Richard. He had been walking down the aisle, heading to the cockpit, when he had witnessed the tense standoff. His eyes scanned the cabin, and then landed on Richard. "What's all this nonsense, Sarah?" Ronald demanded. Sarah stiffened, her lips pressed tightly together, but she didn't speak. "She's denying me my seat," Richard explained, his frustration finally spilling over. Telling me I don't belong here. I'm the pilot. Ronald raised an eyebrow, clearly confused. He glanced at Sarah and then back at Richard. This isn't about the rules, is it? He said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Sarah's face flushed a deep red, and for a moment, Richard thought he saw something shift in her. A flicker of guilt, perhaps. But before anyone could say anything else, Emily cut in. She's right, Emily said, her voice now firm. Captain Owens doesn't have the right ticket to sit in first class. Richard was stunned. There it was again, the unmistakable tone of authority. The "we're in charge, and you're not" attitude. But now, with Ronald present, everything seemed to take on a new weight. For a brief moment, Richard didn't know how to respond. But then, Ronald turned back to Emily and Sarah. "You're both making a huge mistake," he said sternly. "Captain Owens has earned his seat, and he's earned my respect. I suggest you both figure out how to make this right." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard could feel his heart beating in his chest, but a part of him also felt vindicated. Ronald had spoken up, had backed him, but the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And as Ronald turned to leave, Richard caught his eye for a brief moment, a silent understanding passing between them. He knew that something bigger was at play here, something deeper than a simple seating issue. There were layers to this, and Richard wasn't going to stop until he got to the bottom of it. Just as Sarah began to speak again, Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. His pulse quickened when he saw the name flashing on the screen. It was his supervisor. He answered it quickly, his mind racing. "Hello, Richard." The voice on the other end was urgent. "We need to talk. There's something going on here that you don't know about. Something big." His heart skipped a beat. What could it be? And why did it feel like the ground beneath him was shifting once more? Richard's heart raced as he stood in the cabin, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. The tension between him, Sarah, and Emily hung heavy in the air. He could still hear the ringing in his ears from Ronald's words, and his supervisor's urgent voice on the phone only added to the storm brewing in his mind. The unsettling feeling that something bigger was at play, something far beyond a simple misunderstanding, clawed at him. "Richard," the voice on the phone continued, "you need to stay calm. But this situation, it's not what it seems. I don't know all the details yet, but I'm hearing things. We need to get ahead of this before it escalates." Richard was already on edge, but this revelation sent a chill down his spine. What was going on? What did his supervisor know that he didn't? "Can you explain a bit more?" Richard asked, his voice tight. He could feel his stomach knotting up with every second of silence that passed. "I can't say much right now," the supervisor replied, "but just know that there's been a mix-up in the system. You've been flagged. I don't know by who, but it's serious. Someone's trying to undermine you, and they've already put the wheels in motion." Flagged. Undermined. The word struck Richard like lightning. He could feel the floor beneath him giving way. This wasn't just a one-off mistake. This was planned. Someone had set him up. But why? Undermined? What are you talking about? Richard asked, his voice rising. "Why would anyone want to do that? I'm the captain of this flight. I can't go into details over the phone. Just stay alert. We'll talk more when you land. But, Richard, don't trust anyone on that plane. Not yet." The phone call ended abruptly, leaving Richard standing there, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. Who could he trust? He had been working in aviation for so long, earning his place, fighting for his recognition, only to find himself in a situation like this. It felt like a cruel joke, like the rug had been pulled from under him when he least expected it. He turned and looked at Sarah, who was still standing nearby, arms folded, her expression unreadable. Emily had backed away a bit, lingering by the galley, but her eyes were fixed on Richard. The stares of the passengers were now even more uncomfortable, like they were waiting for him to make a move. For a long moment, Richard stood there, breathing deeply, trying to regain control. But the doubt, the fear, it was all still there. His supervisor's cryptic warning echoed in his mind. "Don't trust anyone on that plane." "Captain Owens," Sarah spoke, breaking the silence, her tone softer than it had been moments ago. "I'm sorry for what happened. I truly am. But you need to understand, We're just following procedures. This isn't personal. Richard didn't respond immediately. He was too focused on the phone call, on the unsettling feeling that something more sinister was unfolding. How could this be just a simple mix-up? Why had his supervisor seemed so concerned? I don't know what's going on, Sarah, Richard finally said, his voice controlled but edged with frustration. But I'm not letting this go. Sarah's face softened for a moment, and Richard saw a glimpse of the woman he had known before. She looked like she was about to say something, but before she could, another voice interrupted the conversation. Everything all right here? It was the voice of another flight attendant, Maria. She was older, more experienced, and Richard had always gotten along with her. She was the kind of person who didn't take sides easily and always did her best to make everyone feel comfortable. Not really, Richard replied, giving her a quick look. I'm being told I don't have a right to sit in first class because of some ticket issue. Maria raised an eyebrow. Are you kidding me? That's absurd. She glanced at Sarah and Emily, then back at Richard. I've never heard of anything like that. I'm telling you, Richard continued, his frustration growing. There's something more going on here. Someone is pulling strings, and I need to know who. Maria's face darkened. This doesn't feel right. Let's figure this out after the flight, all right? We'll get to the bottom of this. Richard nodded, grateful for her support. It wasn't much, but at least it was something. As Maria moved away, he felt a fleeting sense of relief. She was on his side, but the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach told him it wasn't over yet. There was more to this story, something he wasn't seeing. As he took his seat in the cockpit, his mind raced. Who was behind all of this? Who had flagged him and why? Was this part of a larger plot, or was he just the unfortunate target of someone's personal vendetta? And then, just as he was about to start going through his pre-flight checks, the door to the cockpit opened. It was Ronald again. Richard, Ronald said, his voice low and urgent. We need to talk. Now. Richard didn't hesitate. Come in, he said, closing the door behind him. What's going on, Ronald? You said this wasn't just a mistake. Ronald's face was grim. It's not. Someone in management is trying to take you down. They've been working behind the scenes for months now. Richard felt his blood run cold. Months? But why? What did I do to deserve this? Ronald shook his head. I don't know all the details yet, but I've heard things. You've been marked for something, Richard, and they're not going to stop until they bring you down. Richard's mind reeled. Who could be behind this? Who want to take him down and why? Ronald continued. Look, I know this sounds crazy, but we need to stick together. If they've already started making moves, we have to be ready. You're not alone in this. Richard nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Whoever was trying to destroy him was about to learn that he wasn't someone to mess with. As the flight began, Richard took a deep breath and focused on what was ahead. This flight was no longer just about flying a plane. It was about surviving what was coming next. The engines roared to life as the plane lifted off, soaring into the sky. But for Richard, the weight of the situation was heavier than the force of the climb. The plane might have been gaining altitude, but his mind was in freefall. The conversation with Ronald had left him shaken. Someone in management was after him. He couldn't wrap his head around it. What had he done to deserve this? Why him? The feeling of betrayal had only intensified since his interaction with Sarah and Emily. What kind of world was he living in, where a man like him, someone who had dedicated his life to his work, could be targeted like this? Ronald's warning echoed in his mind. They're not going to stop until they bring you down. Richard clenched his fists at his sides, staring out the cockpit window, willing himself to focus on the task at hand. The flight was underway, and he needed to get through it without letting his personal turmoil affect the operation. But the knots in his stomach wouldn't loosen. Every turn of the plane felt like it was pulling him deeper into a storm he didn't know how to navigate. He glanced at the instruments, trying to lose himself in the routine, but it was no use. His mind kept drifting back to the phone call with his supervisor, to the cryptic warning, to the sense of dread that had settled over him like a dark cloud. He knew something was wrong, but he had no idea what. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. He couldn't tell. The cabin was calm, almost eerily quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew something he didn't. It was as though the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then the intercom buzzed. "Captain Owens," came Sarah's voice, cool and professional as ever. "We're about to begin the in-flight meal service. Would you like something to eat?" Richard hesitated for a moment before replying. "No, thank you. I'm good." There was a brief pause before Sarah responded, her voice more distant than before. "All right. Let me know if you need anything else." Something about her tone unsettled Richard. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, as if she were still distant, still holding some sort of grudge. He had expected an apology, at least, but nothing had come. There was no hint of remorse, no acknowledgement of what had happened earlier. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the feeling that this flight had turned into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. His phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a text from his supervisor. It read, "Meet me after the flight. You need to be prepared." Prepared for what? Richard felt his stomach tighten again. This was getting out of hand. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than he had realized. He forced himself to focus. The passengers in the cabin were settling in for the long flight, unaware of the tension simmering just behind the scenes. Some were sleeping, others watching movies or chatting quietly amongst themselves. But Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the calm before the storm was about to end. Then the unexpected happened. The plane hit an unexpected pocket of turbulence. The sudden jolt made Richard's heart skip a beat. He grabbed the controls, steadying the plane, his fingers gripping the yoke with a vice-like strength. The cabin shuddered, and the lights flickered for a moment. "Captain," came Sarah's voice over the intercom. Her tone was urgent now. "We're experiencing some turbulence. Do you need any assistance?" Richard bit back the words that nearly escaped him. He wasn't about to be distracted by Sarah's condescending tone right now. The turbulence was nothing he hadn't handled before. But there was something about her voice, something about the way she asked, that didn't sit right with him. Almost like she was testing him, waiting for him to slip up. "I've got it, Sarah," Richard replied firmly. "I don't need any help." But as the turbulence continued to rock the plane, Richard felt something odd, a growing sense of unease, like the turbulence wasn't just physical. It felt like the storm was brewing inside the cabin too. He could almost sense the tension building with every jolt, every shudder of the aircraft. And then he heard it, a scream. It was brief, but it was unmistakable. Someone in the back of the plane had screamed in terror. Richard's heart raced as his grip on the controls tightened. The scream was followed by another, and then a rush of hurried footsteps. He knew something had gone terribly wrong. He didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he switched on the intercom. "Sarah, what's going on back there?" There was a long pause before Sarah's voice crackled through, strained and panicked. "Captain Owens, we have a situation. Someone's causing trouble in the back of the plane." I know. It's one of the passengers. We need help." The words hit Richard like a ton of bricks. In the middle of this turmoil, he was suddenly being pulled into a crisis. But what kind of trouble was Sarah talking about? Had something been triggered? Was this connected to the growing tension he'd been feeling all along? "Lock the cabin doors," Richard ordered, his voice a sharp command. "We can't let anyone get near the cockpit. I'll be right there." He rose from his seat, making his way down the narrow aisle with quick, purposeful steps. The plane was still shaking, the turbulence relentless. But now there was something else, something darker, something more threatening hanging in the air. As Richard reached the back of the plane, he saw the chaos for himself. Several passengers were standing, looking nervously toward the front, while others were seated, whispering urgently among themselves. And in the middle of it all, there was a man, his face flushed with anger, his fists clenched. He was shouting at one of the flight attendants, his words sharp and venomous. "I'll never sit back there with those people," the man spat. "This is absurd. I demand to speak to the captain." Richard felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knew exactly what kind of trouble was brewing now. This wasn't just a random passenger acting out. This was something more targeted. And the words he had just heard, the man's angry, racist rant, sent a shockwave through Richard. He stepped forward, trying to remain calm. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but filled with authority. You need to return to your seat. We're in the middle of a flight, and your behavior is disrupting the safety of this aircraft. The man turned on Richard, his eyes wild with rage. You're the pilot, he sneered. I don't trust people like you. You have no right to tell me what to do. Richard's fists clenched at his sides, but he remained composed. He had been in situations like this before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about insubordination. This was something deeper, something uglier. I don't care about your personal issues, Richard said, his voice cold now. But you will sit down, or I will have you restrained. The man's eyes flared with rage. You think you can intimidate me? He shouted, his voice rising again. You're nothing but a token, a joke. Richard's blood ran cold. He had heard these words before, racist slurs, veiled hatred, but hearing them from a passenger who was out of control, who was ready to turn the entire flight into chaos, was another level of cruelty. Before Richard could respond, the man lunged forward, pushing past the flight attendant who had tried to intervene. It was too late. The situation had spiraled out of control. The man charged forward, his eyes wild with fury, pushing past the startled flight attendant who had been trying to intervene. The cabin erupted into chaos as passengers scrambled in their seats, some standing, others pulling out their phones, unsure of what was about to happen. Richard felt his heart rate spike as he quickly assessed the situation. The man was too close now. His aggressive steps threatened to turn the confrontation into something much worse. The space between Richard and this enraged passenger had closed in an instant. He could feel the heat of the man's anger, but he kept his composure, staying focused. He had to remain calm. He had to control the situation before it escalated any further. Sir, Richard shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded planes for over a decade. You need to sit down. Now. But the man was beyond reason. His face twisted with disgust, his voice rising to a shout. You're nothing but a token. You're just here because they needed someone like you to fill a quota. I don't take orders from people like you. Richard's blood ran cold. He had heard those words before, had experienced this kind of hatred before, but never like this. Never in such an intense, violent form. The plane was shaking with turbulence. But now, it felt like the real storm was brewing inside the cabin. Enough! Richard's voice rang out, commanding attention. But the man, already worked up and caught in his fury, wouldn't stop. I'm not sitting back down. I'm not going anywhere with people like him. The man shouted, pointing directly at Richard with a finger that trembled from anger. Everything was happening too fast. Richard knew that this was no longer just about him. It wasn't even just about the man's outburst anymore. This was a powder keg, and the fuse had already been lit. At that moment, one of the flight attendants, Maria, rushed over, her face pale but determined. Captain, she said, her voice cracking with urgency. We need help. He's out of control. We need to restrain him. Richard quickly nodded. Get the cuffs, he ordered, his voice firm but with a calm that surprised even him. His mind was clear now. This wasn't about control or dignity. This was about safety. The man was too unpredictable to reason with, and every second that passed without action felt like a step closer to disaster. Maria scrambled to the overhead compartments, pulling out the restraints as quickly as she could, her hands shaking. The chaos in the cabin had now reached a boiling point, with several passengers murmuring anxiously to one another, some recording the scene on their phones. But Richard wasn't distracted. His eyes remained locked on the man as he advanced further, now a mere step away from Richard. He could feel the tension in the air. It was as though the very molecules of the cabin were charged with hostility. I'm not a token, Richard said quietly, almost to himself. I'm not here because of a quota. I'm here because I earned this. You need to sit down before you make things worse for yourself. The man sneered. Earned it, he spat. You don't belong here. You never have. And before Richard could respond, the man swung his arm toward him. Instinctively, Richard stepped back, just barely avoiding the strike. The sudden violence stunned him for a moment, but it also pushed him into action. He couldn't let this escalate any further. Grab him! Richard barked. Maria and another flight attendant, John, rushed forward, but the man was wild now, thrashing and shouting, his face twisted with rage. The plane was still shaking, the turbulence adding to the madness. But Richard couldn't afford to let this man tear the cabin apart. With a swift movement, Richard grabbed the man by the arm and forced him into a seat. He was a trained pilot, used to controlling situations in midair, and now he was using every ounce of that discipline to hold this unruly passenger down. "Stay still," Richard commanded, his voice a low growl. He wasn't going to let this man ruin the flight, not when so many lives were in his hands. The passenger, however, kept fighting back, shouting obscenities and pushing against Richard with all his strength. But the man's fury was no match for Richard's determination. Together with Maria and John, Richard quickly secured the man in his seat, using the restraints to ensure he wouldn't cause any more trouble. Finally, the man was subdued, but the damage had already been done. The passengers had witnessed the entire incident, and the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Some looked relieved, others were still too shocked to speak. But no one had been unaffected. As Richard turned away from the restrained passenger, he saw Sarah standing in the aisle, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had watched the entire confrontation unfold in silence. Her face was pale, and her lips were pressed tightly together, as though she was holding back a flood of emotions. For a moment, there was silence between them. Richard could feel the weight of everything that had just happened. This wasn't just a disagreement. This wasn't just a rowdy passenger. This was about racism. This was about a system that didn't want him to succeed. This was about being constantly underestimated and undervalued. Sarah took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Richard," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Richard didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, staring at her. He could see the guilt in her eyes, the conflict. But it was too little, too late. After everything that had happened, after the way she had treated him earlier, he couldn't just accept her apology without understanding the deeper implications of this moment. "You need to understand, Sarah," Richard said, his voice firm but calm. "This isn't just about what happened here today. This is about everything that's been going on behind the scenes. This isn't a one-off mistake. This is part of something bigger." Sarah didn't argue. She simply nodded, her eyes now full of regret. "I know," she said softly, "and I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." But the apology, though sincere, felt hollow, because Richard knew now that the battle wasn't just about a seat on the plane. It wasn't just about the racist passenger who had caused chaos in the cabin. This was about the systemic forces that had been at work long before the flight had even started. And the truth of that, the weight of it, was something that Richard couldn't escape, no matter how much he wished he could. As he turned to head back to the cockpit, his mind racing with everything he had just learned, a message flashed on his phone. It was from his supervisor again. "The storm is coming. Be ready." Richard's stomach dropped. He had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone bring him down without a fight. Richard sat back in the cockpit, his mind racing. The confrontation with the unruly passenger, the mounting tension in the cabin, and the eerie phone message from his supervisor, all of it felt like a storm building on the horizon. He could feel it in the air, like the calm before the ultimate crash. What had started as an ordinary flight was now something much bigger, something far more sinister than he had ever imagined. It was clear now. This wasn't just about a seat or a passenger or a few hurtful words. This was about something that threatened everything Richard had fought for: his career, his dignity, his identity. As the plane leveled out, the turbulence subsided, and the skies outside grew clearer. But inside the cockpit, Richard couldn't shake the unease. The brief apology from Sarah had been a start, but it wasn't enough. There was a bigger game at play, and no one was telling him the full truth. He needed answers. His phone buzzed again, breaking through his thoughts. It was another text from his supervisor. "Meet me in the cockpit when you have a moment. It's time." Time for what? The cryptic messages were getting harder to ignore, and Richard's patience was wearing thin. He wanted to trust his supervisor. He had for years, but the constant feeling that he was being pulled into something bigger, something more dangerous, was starting to feel suffocating. He glanced over at the door, knowing that the tension in the cabin had likely calmed for now. But the passengers had witnessed everything. The scene with the racist passenger, the restraint, the uncomfortable silence that followed. None of it could be erased. He had no doubt that the story was already spreading among the passengers, and the media would catch wind of it soon enough. The question was, what would they say? What would they twist? A sharp knock on the cockpit door interrupted his thoughts. He turned, seeing Ronald standing there, looking more serious than Richard had ever seen him. "Captain," Ronald said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to talk." Richard motioned for him to enter, his heart heavy with foreboding. He had hoped for a more peaceful conversation, but it was clear that things were spiraling further than he had ever anticipated. Ronald stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the tension in his eyes matching Richard's own. "I've been hearing things," he began, his voice quiet. "About you. About what happened back there." Richard nodded, already knowing where this conversation was headed. "Yeah, I heard too." "I'm not surprised." Ronald looked at him sharply. "It's not just rumors, Richard. There are people at higher levels who are not happy with how you've handled things. Not happy that you stood up to that passenger. Not happy that you stood your ground with Sarah. They don't want you rocking the boat. And this could get ugly." Richard felt the weight of Ronald's words settle in. He had known there were issues brewing beneath the surface, had sensed the subtle hostility from some of his colleagues, the quiet undercurrent of resentment. But to hear it confirmed so bluntly shook him to his core. There were forces working against him, pulling strings he couldn't even see, and they were moving fast. "They want me gone, don't they?" Richard asked, his voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. Ronald didn't answer immediately. He just looked at Richard, his expression grim. The silence spoke volumes. "They've already started making moves, Richard," Ronald finally said. "And they're not just going to stop here. You're in their sights now." Richard's stomach twisted. He had worked so hard, climbed so many ladders, fought through so many barriers to get where he was. And now, it felt like the ground was shifting beneath him, like he was being pulled out from under it. It wasn't just about one flight or one incident. This was systemic. He was being targeted because of who he was, because he had succeeded despite the odds stacked against him. But why? Richard's voice broke through the weight of the moment. "What did I do wrong? Why me?" Ronald's face softened, his voice quieter now. "I wish I knew, man. But I've been hearing rumors for months. The higher-ups have been talking about you, about your promotions, about how you've become a face for diversity. And there are people in the company who aren't happy with it. They don't want someone like you representing this airline." Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. The words hit harder than any physical blow. He had known about the subtle racism, the whispers, but to hear it laid out like this, so plainly, made the weight of it unbearable. "So this whole thing, the denial of my seat, the confrontation with that passenger, all of it, this is all part of some bigger plan?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ronald nodded, his expression tight. "They're trying to make you look unstable. They want to discredit you, make you seem like you're a liability. And it's not just in the air. They've been digging into your past, looking for anything to use against you." The word stung like a slap. Richard had worked his entire life to prove that he belonged in the cockpit, that he deserved every step he'd taken to get there. And now, it seemed that all of it was being called into question. He felt a wave of anger surge through him, but he pushed it down, trying to stay calm. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. Ronald looked at him, his expression one of rare sincerity. "You fight back. You don't let them take you down without a fight. This isn't just about you, Richard. It's about everyone who's been pushed aside, everyone who's been told they don't belong. You have a chance to expose all of it, to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. But you need to be careful. You're not dealing with just some disgruntled passengers or coworkers. You're dealing with people who have power, people who have control." Richard nodded, taking in Ronald's words. The weight of the situation hadn't hit him until now. It wasn't just about surviving this flight. It wasn't just about getting through the turbulence. It was about surviving a war that he hadn't asked for, but had been thrust into because of the color of his skin, because of his success in a world that hadn't wanted him to succeed. The intercom buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was Sarah's voice, calm and steady, though Richard could hear the undertones of anxiety. "Captain Owens," she said, "we've received reports from several passengers. They're requesting to speak with you after the flight." Richard didn't answer immediately. He knew what that meant. The passengers who had witnessed the confrontation were now taking sides, and he had no idea how deep this thing was going to go. "Well," Richard said, taking a deep breath, "I guess we'll see who's really on my side." Ronald clapped him on the back, a small gesture of support. "You've got this, Richard. Just stay sharp. And remember, this is bigger than any flight." As the plane continued its course, Richard's thoughts were swirling. He had just learned something he hadn't expected, that the fight wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been pushed aside, underestimated, and held back. But as the storm raged on, Richard knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. The rest of the flight was a blur for Richard. As the plane cruised at altitude, the minutes dragged on like hours. His mind was consumed by the brewing storm, by the whispers of a conspiracy that threatened to dismantle everything he had worked for. Every time he glanced over at the passengers in the cabin, he saw their eyes on him, some sympathetic, some judgmental. No one spoke openly about what had happened, but it was clear that the tension had settled in. The small group of passengers who had been involved in the incident had started to spread their own versions of what had occurred. Some felt sympathy for Richard, others saw him as part of the chaos. The air around him felt thick, almost suffocating, and every time the intercom buzzed, it only added to the mounting pressure. His supervisor had warned him, the storm is coming. It had already arrived. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This wasn't just about one angry passenger. It was about a systemic effort to take him down, and every step Richard took from here on out would be watched carefully. As the flight continued, the turbulence had calmed, but the storm inside the cockpit hadn't. He had just a few hours left before they landed, but so much could change between now and then. The whole world seemed to be hanging in the balance, and he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that his entire life was about to unravel. And then, a voice broke through his thoughts. It was Ronald again. "Richard," Ronald said, stepping into the cockpit with urgency, his face tight with concern. "We need to talk. Now." Richard turned to face him, trying to mask the growing anxiety that was creeping up inside. He knew that whatever Ronald had to say was crucial. Ronald had been his ally throughout all of this, but Richard couldn't help but feel the weight of uncertainty hanging between them. "What's going on, Ronald?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice even, though his nerves were betraying him. Ronald closed the door behind him, his movements sharp. "It's worse than we thought. Word's already getting out. The media is sniffing around, and passengers have started to file complaints. The flight crew is divided. Some are sympathetic, but others, well, they're not. And it's not just here, Richard. It's beyond this flight. This is bigger." Richard's stomach churned. He knew the storm was coming, but hearing it so plainly from Ronald made the reality of it all feel even more suffocating. The spotlight was now on him, and not just the passengers or the flight attendants. Everyone was watching. "So what now?" Richard asked, his voice low, filled with both frustration and fear. "What do I do?" Ronald took a deep breath, his gaze steady but filled with urgency. "You keep your head down for now. The moment we land, we have to figure out our next move. But right now, you need to prepare for what's coming. I'm telling you, they're building a case against you. They'll try to discredit you in any way they can." Richard clenched his fists, his thoughts racing. The idea of having his entire career ripped apart by lies, by people who didn't see him for who he truly was, filled him with a fiery anger. He had earned every inch of his success. He had fought against the odds for years, just to be in this cockpit, just to have the opportunity to show the world what he was capable of. And now it was being threatened by those who couldn't stand to see someone like him succeed. "I'm not backing down," Richard said, the determination in his voice cutting through the tension. "I've worked too hard for this. If they want to fight, they'll get one." Ronald looked at him, a mix of admiration and concern in his eyes. "I know you're strong, Richard, but we need to be careful. They'll come at you from every angle. They're not just going to attack your work. They're going to try to tear you down personally. And they're ruthless." Richard nodded, his mind spinning with the implications. The fight was no longer just about one confrontation with a racist passenger. It was about something bigger, something systemic. He had become a target for standing up for himself, for doing what was right. "I'll deal with it," Richard said, his voice steady. "But I need to know everything. I need to know who's behind this. Who's pulling the strings?" Ronald hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't have all the answers, but I've been hearing some names. Some people in high positions who aren't happy with the changes in the company, with the way things have been evolving. They're trying to push out anyone who's threatening their control. And you, Richard, you've become a symbol for that change. You've become the face of progress." Richard took in Ronald's words, the reality of it all sinking in deeper than ever before. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He had become a target for those who feared change, for those who saw his success as a threat to their own power. As they talked, the turbulence picked up again, but this time, it wasn't just the weather that was shaking the plane. It was the weight of the truth, the burden of knowing that everything was about to change. The storm was no longer just a metaphor. It was real, and Richard was at the center of it. "We're coming in for a landing soon," Richard said, trying to focus. "I'll have to face them once we land. The media, the passengers. It's all going to blow up. But I won't back down." Ronald nodded, his face serious. "You got the right attitude. But remember, you're not in this alone. We'll fight this together. Just be ready for whatever comes next." Richard took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mind was a whirlwind of uncertainty and anger. But through it all, there was one thing he knew for sure. This fight was far from over. He wasn't going to let them win. Not when so much was on the line. As the plane began its descent, Richard's eyes hardened with resolve. Whatever storm awaited him on the ground, he was ready to face it. He had earned his place in the cockpit, and no one, no matter how powerful, was going to take that from him. The plane's wheels touched down on the runway with a soft thud, the sound barely breaking through the storm of thoughts racing through Richard's mind. The passengers slowly started to stir from their seats, reaching for their belongings, chatting quietly. But Richard couldn't focus on them. He couldn't focus on anything but the uneasy tension that hung in the air. It was almost as if the world outside the plane had stopped moving. "Richard," Ronald's voice cut through the silence of the cockpit, bringing him back to the present. "The storm's about to hit. We need to get ready." Richard nodded, his jaw tight. The descent had been smooth, but his thoughts were anything but. He had no idea what to expect when they landed. But he knew one thing for sure. The fight was just beginning. The flight hadn't been the end of his battle. It had been the prelude. The real confrontation would happen once they reached the ground. As the plane taxied to the gate, Richard took a moment to collect his thoughts. His grip on the controls was steady, but inside, his nerves were on edge. The air felt heavier with every passing second, as if everything was about to change in an instant. He could already imagine the media storm that was brewing. The headlines, the reporters, the cameras, they would all be there, ready to pounce on every detail of what had happened. And when they heard the full story, they would tear it apart. They would twist it, and they would drag him through the mud. But Richard wasn't going to let that happen. He had worked too hard to get here, to prove his worth. He had faced so many obstacles throughout his career, racism, discrimination, doubt, and he had risen above them all. He wasn't going to let a few people with an agenda take him down. He had the truth on his side, and he was going to make sure the world saw it. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, Richard took a deep breath and unclipped his seatbelt. Ronald was already standing, his posture tense but determined. "You ready for this?" Ronald asked quietly, his eyes locked on Richard. "I don't have a choice," Richard replied. "Let's do it." The moment they stepped off the plane, it was like entering another world. The media had already gathered near the gate, cameras flashing, microphones raised, reporters shouting questions that Richard couldn't even hear over the din. It felt like a circus, a spectacle, and standing in the middle of it all was the very last thing Richard wanted. But he had to face it. He had no other choice. He couldn't hide from this. The world was watching, and he was about to give them something they weren't expecting. As they walked through the airport, Richard could feel the eyes of everyone on him. Some of the passengers who had been on the flight had gathered near the baggage claim, whispering to one another, but all eyes turned to him as he passed. The murmur started immediately, some sympathetic, some doubtful, some full of judgment. The whispers, the glances, the way people avoided meeting his eyes. It was all part of the show, and Richard hated every second of it. But he kept walking, his shoulders squared, his head held high. He wasn't going to let anyone see him break. Not now. Not ever. And then, the moment he dreaded arrived. A reporter, microphone in hand, stepped in front of him. "Captain Owens," she called, her voice sharp and intrusive. "Can you tell us what happened today? There's been a lot of buzz about your confrontation with the passenger and the stewardess. What's your side of the story?" Richard froze for a brief moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The questions were coming fast now, each one more invasive than the last. "Do you have anything to say about the racial comments made on board?" another reporter shouted, shoving their microphone closer to his face. "Do you feel the airline is treating you unfairly?" He took a deep breath, pushing the fear and anxiety to the back of his mind. He had prepared for this moment, even if he hadn't wanted it. He knew what he had to do. "I'm not here to talk about the incident," Richard said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise. "I'm here to talk about something much bigger. What happened today isn't just about a single passenger or a stewardess. It's about the systemic racism that exists in every corner of society, in places like this, and beyond. It's about how people like me are constantly underestimated, undervalued, and targeted because of who we are." The reporters fell silent for a moment, taken aback by the intensity in his voice. But they quickly recovered, eager for more. "Captain Owens, are you saying the airline is complicit in this?" a voice called from the crowd. Richard didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, the word ringing out with certainty. "I'm saying that there are people at higher levels who have been working against me. This isn't just one isolated incident. This is about a system that has been built to make people like me feel like we don't belong. And I'm here to tell you that I belong. I've earned my place in that cockpit, and no one will take that from me." The crowd shifted. The cameras clicked, and the reporter scribbled down every word. But for a moment, there was a sense of respect in the air. Richard could feel it, the shift. This wasn't just about a confrontation anymore. This was about a story that was much bigger than he was, a story that needed to be told. Before anyone could ask another question, Richard turned and walked away, his steps quick and purposeful. The reporters called after him, but he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had said what he needed to say. As he reached the exit, Ronald was waiting for him, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "You did good, Richard," he said, his voice low. "I'm not done yet," Richard replied, his eyes hard with resolve. "This is just the beginning. There's more to this story, and I'm going to make sure it gets told. I'm not going down without a fight." Ronald nodded, his face serious. "And I'll be right there with you." As they stepped into the parking lot, the weight of what had just happened hit Richard. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The media would continue to spin their stories. The higher-ups would continue their campaign to discredit him, and the world would watch. But Richard wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't going to let them win. He had a story to tell, and he was going to make sure the world heard it. The air in the parking lot was heavy with tension. Richard could feel the weight of the moment settle around him, but he wasn't going to let the fear consume him. The storm that had followed him through the airport had been just the beginning. Now, as he walked toward his car, the reality of what was at stake began to sink in deeper. The battle for his career, for his dignity, was no longer just a personal fight. It was a fight for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. "Richard," Ronald said, his voice breaking the silence, "I need you to stay focused. There's more going on behind the scenes than we even know. But the media is not the only thing we need to worry about. There are people in the company who are making moves, and they're playing dirty." Richard took a deep breath, his hands gripping the keys in his pocket. The thought of everything he had worked for slipping away, the idea that those in power could destroy him so easily, made his blood boil. But he wasn't about to let them win. "I'm focused," Richard replied, his voice firm, though his mind was spinning. He had just given that powerful statement to the reporters, but deep down, he knew that wasn't enough. The story wasn't over. The fight wasn't over, and if they wanted to take him down, they were going to have to work harder than this. I've been hearing more about who's behind this, Ronald continued, his voice lowering. It's not just random execs. Some of the top brass, the ones who make the calls on promotions and personnel, they've been pulling strings. They've been watching you for a while now, waiting for you to make a mistake. The words hit Richard like a blow to the chest. People were watching him, waiting for him to slip, to fail. He had known that there were challenges he'd have to face, but he hadn't expected this kind of attack, so organized, so deliberate. Ronald paused for a moment, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. And it's not just the airline, Richard. I'm hearing things from outside sources too. People with power want to keep this kind of change from happening. They want to keep control. Richard felt a sharp pang of disbelief in his chest. This was bigger than he thought. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was part of a larger, systemic effort to shut him down. He wasn't just fighting for his career. He was fighting against a system that had been designed to hold people like him back, to push them aside at every turn. Then we need to expose them, Richard said, his voice hardening with determination. I'm not going to let them win. If they think they can take me down this easily, they have another thing coming. Ronald nodded, his eyes filled with equal parts worry and pride. We need to be smart about this. We can't just make a lot of noise and expect it to go away. We have to make our next move count. Richard opened the door to his car and slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and for a moment, he allowed himself to focus on the steady hum of the vehicle, the feel of the road beneath the tires. But even then, his mind raced with what lay ahead. What would happen when he met with his supervisor? What other pieces of the puzzle would be revealed in the coming days? He couldn't afford to wait. He couldn't afford to sit back and let them control the narrative. This was bigger than one meeting or one confrontation. He needed to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been marginalized, who had been told they didn't belong. Ronald, Richard said, breaking the silence as he pulled onto the highway. We need to get to the bottom of this. We need to find out who's pulling the strings, who's making these calls. We can't let them hide in the shadows. I'm with you, Ronald replied, his voice steady but serious. I'll see what I can find. But we have to be careful, Richard. We're not just dealing with small-time players. These are people who have the power to ruin you. We need evidence, and we need it fast. Richard nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. It was clear that the road ahead would be full of obstacles. The higher-ups in the airline weren't just going to back down, not when they had so much to lose. But Richard wasn't afraid. He had come too far to be intimidated now. As he drove through the streets, his mind flashed back to that moment in the airport, when he had stood before the cameras and made his declaration. That moment had felt powerful, but now, in the quiet of the car, he knew it wasn't enough. He needed to build momentum. He needed to make sure that people understood the depth of what was happening here, the dark forces that were at play. He had to stay ahead of them. He couldn't let them dictate his future. He had to expose them for what they were. Cowards who hid behind a system that oppressed people like him. The drive to his supervisor's office felt like the longest trip of his life. Every mile seemed to stretch on, every second heavier than the last. By the time he reached the office, his hands were clammy with sweat, but his mind was sharp, focused. He parked his car and took a deep breath. It was time to face the music. Inside, the office was quiet, the walls lined with framed diplomas and certificates of achievement, things that felt hollow in that moment. Richard knocked once, and the door opened to reveal his supervisor, Daniel Martin, a tall man in his late 40s with a stern expression. Richard, Daniel said, his voice cool, but tinged with something Richard couldn't quite place. Come in. Richard stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Richard sat down, his gaze unwavering. You wanted to talk, Richard said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. So talk. Daniel didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a deep breath and leaned forward. I think you know why we're here, Richard, he said slowly. We've received reports, some from passengers, some from within the company, and the situation has escalated. We've got people pushing for your removal, Richard. And it's not just the incident with the passenger. There's a whole campaign being built against you. Richard felt his heart skip a beat. His suspicions had been right all along. They weren't just targeting him for one thing. They were systematically trying to bring him down, piece by piece. What's their plan? Richard asked, his voice firm. What are they going to do? Daniel hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. They've already made their move. The board's discussing it. You've been flagged, and they've requested that your next flight be your last. I wish I could do something more, but you're already under investigation. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He had known it was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all too real. But in that moment, he knew something that Daniel didn't. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Richard leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Daniel's. If they want to fight, I'll give them one. But I'm not going down without exposing everything. They can't destroy me. Not this time. Daniel's face hardened. You've got more enemies than you realize, Richard. And Richard knew he was right. The meeting with Daniel Martin, his supervisor, was everything Richard had feared and more. The confirmation of the conspiracy against him, the systematic campaign to tear him down, was a bitter pill to swallow. But as he left Daniel's office, something within him shifted. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't even fear. It was resolve. He had fought against the odds his entire life, and this was no different. If they wanted to take him down, they would have to drag him through every fight he had in him. The moment he stepped out of the building, the weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders. The cameras, the reporters, the board, everyone had a stake in the game now, and Richard was caught in the center of it all. But no matter what happened, he wasn't going to let anyone erase the truth. He wasn't going to let them define his legacy. Richard called Ronald as soon as he stepped into his car, his voice steady but laced with determination. They're going for it. The board wants me out, but I'm not giving up. I know you won't, Ronald replied, his voice full of conviction. But we need to act fast. We can't just let them control the narrative. You've got to make sure you get the truth out there before they turn it into a witch hunt. Richard gripped the steering wheel, his eyes focused on the road ahead. I'm going to make them hear me, Ronald. I'll expose the whole system. I'm not just fighting for myself anymore. I'm fighting for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. As he drove, Richard knew that the fight was no longer just about him. It was about something much bigger, something that went beyond a seat on an airplane or a single racist comment. It was about systemic change, about exposing the truth, about standing up and refusing to be silenced. His phone buzzed again, and he didn't have to check it to know who it was. Another text from his supervisor. The board has scheduled a hearing for tomorrow. Be prepared. Richard felt a surge of anger mixed with a calm determination. They wanted to break him. They wanted to make an example out of him. But he wasn't going to let them. He wasn't going to sit back and let his life's work be torn apart by a few people who were too afraid to change. The next morning, as Richard walked into the conference room for the hearing, he felt the weight of every eye on him. The board members were seated at a long table, their faces impassive, their eyes cold. It felt like a courtroom, a trial where his guilt had already been decided before the evidence had even been presented. Daniel Martin was there too, sitting off to the side, his expression unreadable. The room was filled with tension, an atmosphere so thick that it felt like it could suffocate him. But Richard stood tall, his back straight, his eyes unwavering. I'm here to speak the truth, he began, his voice carrying through the room. I'm not here to defend myself against baseless accusations. I'm here to expose the truth about what's been happening at this company, about the people who are trying to destroy me, and others like me, because of who we are, not what we've done. He glanced around the room, making eye contact with the board members one by one. They shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding his gaze, others trying to maintain their composure. But Richard wasn't going to let them hide. Not anymore. Let me be clear, he continued, his voice growing stronger. This isn't just about me. This is about the systemic racism that's been allowed to fester within this company, within this industry, for far too long. It's about the people who have used their power to undermine the progress of those who don't fit into their narrow vision of who belongs. And I'm here to tell you that I will not be silenced. I will not let you erase my achievements, my career, or my dignity. The room was silent now, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Richard could see the shift in the atmosphere. Some of the board members were looking uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, glancing at each other. They hadn't expected this kind of response, not from someone like him. But Richard was done playing their game. He wasn't going to back down. He took a deep breath and continued, his tone measured but full of conviction. I've earned my place at this table. I've earned my place in that cockpit, and I will fight for that right until the very end. The silence in the room was deafening. For a long moment, no one said a word. Then, finally, one of the board members, an older man with graying hair, cleared his throat. Captain Owens, he said, his voice low, your words are powerful, but we cannot ignore the concerns that have been raised about your conduct. You've been flagged, and the evidence against you is... Richard didn't wait for him to finish. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man's. The evidence you speak of is fabricated, Richard said, his voice cutting through the air. There is no evidence. There is no proof of misconduct. What you have is a smear campaign, and I'm here to tell you that I will not allow it. You want me gone because I'm a threat to your status quo. You want me gone because I stand for something you refuse to acknowledge. That change is inevitable, and it's coming whether you like it or not. The room was silent again, but this time, there was something different in the air. Richard could feel it. The shift in the tide, the realization that he wasn't going to be cowed. The fight wasn't over, but it was far from lost. The chairman of the board, a middle-aged woman with glasses, finally spoke. We will take all of this into consideration, she said, her voice cold but respectful. You may go now, Captain Owens. Richard nodded, his eyes still locked on hers. Thank you. But remember this. No matter what you decide, I will keep fighting, and I will keep exposing the truth. You can't hide from it forever. As he left the room, he could feel the eyes of the board members on him, their gazes filled with a mixture of doubt, frustration, and finally respect. They hadn't expected him to come out swinging, but that's exactly what he had done. And as he walked down the hallway, his phone buzzed again. It was Ronald. You did it. The truth is out. They can't ignore you anymore. Richard smiled to himself. The fight wasn't over, but he had made sure that they knew. He was not going to be taken down without a fight. This was just the beginning.